All right. Good morning. How is everybody? All right. I'm glad you are. It's good to see everybody. It's all right. I'll probably nod off too, so it's all right. Uh, but any announcements we need to make before we get started? I don't know of any. All right. Be turning your Bibles to Genesis 38. We'll finish this up and get into chapter 39. As we said last week, chapter 38, I'm not just 100% sure why the Lord put it in there. And Moses, by inspiration, wrote it, of course, but why it was put in there. I know it has a purpose. I know it does, in essence, give us kind of an illustration of the Levirate marriage, how it works. But it doesn't set out to say this is how that works. And it interrupts the flow. I was thinking about that again, and I was reading Worsby in his little devotional type commentary, and he says about four paragraphs about this chapter, and then when he gets to chapter 39, he says, and back to the story. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. But anyway, Genesis 38, we're in the midst of discussion with Judah and Tamar, and of course, Tamar's husband's passed away. Judah basically said if you look in verse 11, Judah said to Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown, and then basically I'll make sure that he takes care of you. And to make a long story short, he grows up. Judah does not give him to Tamar. Tamar then disguises herself. She, in essence, you could say she plays the role of a harlot. Verse 15 and 16, he asks Judah when he sees Tamar, doesn't know who she is. He asks that he might be with her. And anyway, he tells her, he promises her in verse 17, he says, I'll send a young goat from the flock. And so she asks about that pledge. She says, she said, I want more, is in essence what she said. Well, what do you want? Well, as we closed out last week, we talked about how that she wanted a signet ring on a cord, and she said she wanted his staff. So she wanted personal possessions. She wanted things that could really be said to be his, not just be anybody's, but be his. And so that's kind of where we are. And we get to verse 20. It says, Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adumite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand, but he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, where's the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, there's not been a harlot in this place. And so he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. Also the men of the place said, there's no harlot in this place. Judah said, let her take them for herself, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her. So here's the problem. She's played the role of the harlot. She's evidently played it to the point that Judah has no clue who she is still. It comes time to send back what he promised, and they can't find her because they're saying there's no harlot in this place. Now, I understand, and I know you do, but remember that in this time era of, say, Genesis, that harlotry was practiced. I'm not saying it was right. It was practiced. Prostitution from a standpoint of cultic prostitution, religious, what we would consider religious prostitution, was practiced in biblical times. Now, like I said, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it was practiced. And so this is something that was going on at that point in time, and it evidently happened with regards to Judah and Tamar. And Judah's kind of upset now because this woman that he's been with, his servants, no one can find her. And people are saying, there hadn't been a harlot here hadn't been one. And so where is she? And so verse 24, it came to pass about 3 months. So time is elapsing on. And that's one thing I remind people of, and I think we all should be reminded. Because I constantly, in my own personal study, am reminding myself, time passes on. We read, 3 or 4 verses in 15 seconds, let's say, and think, well, this happened quickly. Time passed on, and so it gives us a little time frame here. 3 months passed on after Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she's with child by harlotry. And so Judah gets a report that Tamar has not been the woman that she should have been. She's been a woman of ill repute, and now she's with child. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Even in this time frame, it seems as if, and of course we do know a little later on, especially when Moses receives the law on Mount Sinai, that religious harlotry, while practiced, was kind of an affront to Israel. They took it as wrong. They took it as a sin. And so Judah says, bring her out, and we're gonna kill her. We're gonna burn her at the stake. And so she was brought out, and she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please determine whose these are. And she produced the signet ring, the cord, and the staff. She produced Judah's stuff. Now, like I say, it wasn't stuff that you could say, well, anybody's got those, or somebody else. That's somebody else's. These were personal items that she's asked for, and she's able to determine, and he's able to determine, oh, this is my stuff. So Judah, verse 26, acknowledged them and said, she's been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and she never knew her, and he never knew her again. Now, if you think about this, you can think about it from the standpoint of religious harlotry, but you can also think about it a little differently. You can think about it with regards to the Levirate marriage. The Levirate marriage was such that you married, and if say your husband died, then you were to be with his brother, and there you were to produce children. And so this is a forerunner to something that we find out really about a little later on in Scripture that was practiced in Old Testament times. And so when Tamar's husband had died and Judah had promised Shelah, and Shelah was not given, now all of a sudden Judah's able to say, or is willing to say, well, she's really more righteous than I. The thought in verse 26, the very beginning, Judah acknowledged. How exactly public he acknowledged it, we don't know, but it would seem as if, at least to me, that he's saying, okay, since he's saying she's more righteous than I, that he's acknowledging this publicly. Some folks have problems acknowledging their sins. A sin is a sin is a sin is a sin, no matter what the sin is. But a sin, no matter what it is, must be acknowledged or confessed at least to the point of which it is known when we are acknowledging the things of our life. And so Judah, though, he gives us, if you will, sort of a little help, a little understanding of the idea of confession, because he says he acknowledged them. And so he said, never again. Now, we asked the question, and the question does beg to be answered, and I don't have an answer for it. But in the Levirate marriage, you went to be with your spouse's brother, not with your father-in-law. So the question is, and like I say, I don't really have an answer for it, scripturally or historically, was the father-in-law also, if you will, part of the package? The answer would seem to be implied that evidently so, but we don't know that for fact. And so it came to pass in verse 27, at the time of giving birth, that behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread, bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. We don't have twins in our family. You may have twins in your family. I've always wondered, in my own stupidity, I've always wondered, do you really know if you've got your right name? Do you know? So, Mom could have, if I'd had a twin brother, Mom could have called me Evan, and I could have been Paul. I've always wondered. I know mamas and daddies can tell the difference. I do know that. But it's just one of those weird things I've always had. But to tell the difference, they tied a scarlet thread around the first one. So now they understand the difference. I have heard of marking babies, like in the hospital and when they come home. And that would, if Suzanne and I had them, that would have been real smart for me if they'd have done that for me to help me out for a while at least. Because I saw twin boys here not long ago, and I told the grandmother, I said, I can't tell them apart. So, good luck. And so it's fun. Anything else?
Are there any more examples of being put to the stake in the Bible?
Examples, I don't know. I know it happened. I know it happened all through history. I want to say there is in Kings, but I'm going to say I don't know right now. Let me study it. That is a good question. It's a real good question. I'm going to think about that. No. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a great point. No. No. That's firstborn. Yes. Yes. This is probably the reason, but yeah, and I forgot which person I was reading that might be the reason this chapter's in the text. So if you do the chronology, Matthew 1, Luke 2, that wise Prezite mentioned, and that's a good point. I'm glad you brought it up. Anything else? So then it happened, verse 29, as he drew back his hand, that his brother came out unexpectedly, and she said, how do you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name was called Perez, or a breach. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah. So that answers what? Anything else? All right, I want to get into the 39th chapter and see how far we can get this morning. This is as I said, Worsby says, and he's right. Now we get back to the story. Now we get back to Joseph and telling his story, and it's a great story. The story today really tells us a couple of things. It teaches a great lesson about wrong's wrong, no matter what, but it also teaches us a lesson about how to deal with temptation. We'll look at that as we get into the text. But let's look at it. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, and that carries you back to the 37th chapter. So an Egyptian bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from that time that he had made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessings of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread that he ate. Gives you really a good insight into Joseph. Joseph's character, Joseph's quality. He evidently was a good worker. He was evidently trusted. He was an individual that could be not only trusted, but entrusted. It gives us insight not only into Joseph, but it gives us a little insight, if you will, into God's workings. Here's a young guy sold into slavery. Life looked bad. Life looked terrible. Life looked like it wasn't going to come out the way he wanted it to come out. And yet, he rose in power. Now, one of the great things we see as well, because we've heard this story many times and we know the end of the story, is the workings of the providence of God. We know you can say, well, all of this is the hand of God. He's sold into slavery by his brothers who were jealous of him. And now he gets over there and he gets, if you will, as it says, he's in the house of this Egyptian, this ruler, and he rises in power. And so we can't just all lay it, if you will, at the hands of the fact that an Egyptian, if that's how you want to refer to him, would put Joseph, a man of character, in his position, and it just happened to be all happenstance. No, hand of God. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, he's able to save them. Good point. Anything else? Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance, it says, verse 6. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Well, sort of like Billy said a while ago, said, the Bible really holds nothing back. And this is true at this point in time. Here's a woman who has some powers, standing, if you will, in the community. She may have an issue, personal issue. But Joseph, being handsome, she looks upon him and she says, as she lifts her eyes towards him, she says, "Why don't you come and sleep with me? Why don't you come lie with me? Why don't you come and we'll have conjugal rights together?" And so he refused, verse 8. And he said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house. He's committed all that he has to my hand. There's no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" There's a sadness in this story, as there always seems to be with sin. And that is that here's a woman that's willing to commit sin, but here's a good man that's willing to say no. That's the good part of it, but the bad part of it is the willingness of a woman to sin. And yet, when you look at it and you say, "Man, what else would she want?" Well, we don't know the relationship that she had with her husband, but we do know, excuse me, we do know that she would have a sense of power, prestige, a sense of being an influence. She would have material things at her disposal. But she didn't, for whatever reason, have enough, at least she thought. And so as she says, look, come on, and let's you lie with me and let's do this. And he says no. His character will not allow him to do that. In many ways, if you think about it, he remembers who he is. But not only does he remember who he is, but if you think about it as well, he remembers who he's going to hurt. He's going to hurt his master, because he says my master has committed everything to me. He doesn't even know what's going on in this house. Now that's very possible. You get several slaves, you get a lot of things going on. You don't know what's going on in your house. Maybe you're more consumed with business, if you will. He has no idea. Joseph says he has no idea what's going on. He says, I do the things that need to be done, and I take care of all those things, and he has no clue. And so lo and behold, there's no reason for him to know. But he goes on to say, I can't do this. I can't do this. Why? Because I'm going to hurt Potiphar. I'm going to hurt him. And when you also see that he remembers, not only is he going to hurt his master, but he's going to hurt his ultimate master. I'd hurt God. I'd sin against my God. Notice what he says, last part of verse 9, and sin against God. I cannot do that. I can't bear the idea of sinning against my Father. There's, to me, the golden principle in overcoming temptation. How can I do this to my God? How can I do this to the individual that loves me, the individual that's given me everything that I have, the individual that watches over me, the individual that takes care of my every need, that supplies all that I have? How can I do this against him? And so he remembers who he is, and he remembers who he's going to hurt. And verse 10 says, so it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. This is not a one-time. She doesn't just come up one time and say, look, how about today? And he says no. And she go away and she says, okay, I asked him, that was it. It's finished. She keeps on. Day by day, it says, she spoke with Joseph. And he would have been there, in and out. And she spoke to him day by day. Oh, come on, let's do this. And notice that he would not. He did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. He kept his eye on the goal. That, when he told her the first time, can't do this, Master's giving me everything except for you, and he couldn't give me you because you're his wife. You belong to him, not to me. You're his. And so he carries it a step further, and he says, no. I can't sin against God. And so now he's kept his eye on the goal. This is not what I want to do. This is not how I want this to happen. And so he refused really her advancements. And then verse 11 says, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. When you think about this, it reminds you of several things. least me, it reminds me, first of all, of the fact that what goes on in private is not always the same thing as the story that's told outside. You ever been a part of a private conversation and someone else comes and tell you about it, and you say, when did that happen and where was that? And then when they tell you, you have to say, that's not what happened. I wasn't there. I didn't do that. I wasn't involved in it like that. I'm thinking of an incident that happened to me back some time ago. It wasn't that private, but no one really heard it. There were a few people in the house. And so then many months later, I received information that this little private conversation that I had had with two people, that I had said something, and I had not. I had listened to one of those two people say it and told the individual, I said, that was said, but I didn't say it. I don't know where you got your information from. And of course, the sad part was, and here's the sad part, that one of those two people that had said it, they told that individual that I said it. And there was not a whole lot of recourse that I had. There were other mitigating factors, and there's not a whole lot of recourse that I had. When things go on in private, and there are things that need to go on in private, there's conversations that need to go on in private. There are times in which you do need private, but you have to understand what's private sometimes when it becomes public is not the same thing. She's pretty shrewd, isn't she? She's pretty quick on her feet. Makes you wonder what. This has happened before with her. We don't know. But Joseph, is so fast to want to get out of there that when she grabs him, when she catches him by the coat, she says, come lie with me. And he says, no way. And he gets out of there. He's taking off his clothes. He's taking off his coat. And no respectful Jew would have left their coat behind, would have been the thinking. And so all of a sudden she comes out, and she comes out, seemingly, it says, in the street. And she says, look what's been brought in. Look what's been brought in. They've brought this Hebrew in. He's made fun of us. He's laughed at us. He's mocked us. And when he came to me, I didn't want anything to do with him. And so when he heard that I had raised my voice, was afraid somebody would come in, he's run out. A woman scorned. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Verse 16. Then she spoke to him with words like these. The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. This woman would be called in our terms today a liar. But look at her lie, if you will. Her lie, first of all, is to blame Joseph as a Hebrew. In other words, let's throw some prejudice out here. If you hadn't brought this Hebrew in, it's not the individual. All of a sudden, it's become a national thing. If you hadn't brought this Hebrew in, prejudice is a terrible thing. In many ways, to a degree, probably all of us have a little bit of prejudice, whether we realize it or not. It is incumbent upon us to remember to love all men and not have that prejudice, to overcome that prejudice. But then go on a little bit further with what she says. The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us, in other words, it's your fault. This is your fault. And so she's trying to throw everything else on somebody else. It's not me, and it's not my fault. It's not up to me. It's you, and it's the Hebrew people, because they don't like us. You brought him in to mock us, and so it's not my fault. It's the Hebrew servant. It's also the fact that you came, you brought him in. And then she tells him the same tale, if you will, as she told the people in verse 14 and 15. So it is that when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him, put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. He was there in prison. Well, that's tough, isn't it? Think about Joseph's life for just a second. Let's kind of interrupt, but go back to Joseph. That's kind of who I want to key on the rest of this study of Genesis. A man of character, a man of good stature, a man that has so loved God and committed himself to God that, here has been an opportunity to have sinned. It would have been an easy opportunity to have sinned. He's head over everything. He could take care of the servants that maybe would have known or whatever. He could have made sure that no one would know. But he couldn't sin against God. He couldn't sin against his master. And so now all of a sudden, as she makes this plea, he's thrown into prison. I didn't do anything before. My dad loved me. I was at home with my brothers. My brothers didn't like me. They sold me into slavery. I've risen to power through time. I've been an individual that's been what I'm supposed to be. I've loved God. I've tried to act the way I'm supposed to act and be the way I'm supposed to be. And now look where I am again. I'm in prison. Life does not always go the way we want it to go, the way we think it should go, or the way we think it ought to go. But the Lord, verse 21, was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The idea there, he gave him favor, is interesting. It has the idea of he caused him to be. Caused him to have or to be viewed with favor. So God is watching over Joseph this whole time. God has never left Joseph. God has never forsaken Joseph. God wasn't all of a sudden, kind of on the sidelines just saying, well, I'll get in there. He was watching all of it. And so the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. So his reputation, his character comes out again. It's sterling. He's in prison. He's sort of the keeper, if you will, of all the prisoners. The keeper of the prison itself, verse 23, did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. It's pretty good, isn't it? A man of character. This chapter just oozes with that idea that Joseph was willing to do what was right and follow God's will because he understood that God was important. And there seems to be, as one individual that I was reading says, maybe Joseph knew, if not at least had faith, that God was always with him. And God had not forsaken him. And so with that, Joseph is able to move forward in life. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, you take your wife over a slave. I mean, even though Joseph was probably well thought of by him, he's still a slave. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Right. That's right. Yeah. No.
I guess his social standing and whatever else was more important than
Well,
like a true story.
yeah, one of the things that I don't know is of course in that time you would have had at least multiple wives or what would be considered a wife and a harem, uh, depending upon how you would preference that. And you got to keep all of them happy. Uh, you wonder, and there's no way of knowing, but you wonder really what kind of temperament she had. And a woman scorned is bad. Man scorned is bad too. Don't get me wrong. Anybody scorned is really bad. Yeah, that's why I'm not saying it in church. But I've thought about it several times this week. But anybody that's scorned is bad. But I don't know. And anybody got on that? Okay.
In our life, we need to have edges. It says not only was Joseph unwilling to lie with him, be with her, even to be around her, he couldn't stay away from this woman.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a true point.
One other person that Joseph was a brother of himself.
Yeah.
That Michael was not.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, I wrote down in my notes. I preached a series of sermons on Genesis back 15 years ago, and I addressed this chapter as overcoming temptation, and I talked about remember who you hurt. He thought about God and really even in Acts 7 verse 26, evidently his brethren. Second of all, in learning to overcome temptation, learn how to refuse in advance. Think about it. She'd asked him. She kept asking him. He had to stand up. This is no easy task. Thirdly, keep your eye on the goal. Fourthly, remember who you are. Remember his position. He was in a position that he could have covered this up as well. But he remembered who he was, and so he kept really himself in perspective, but also his humility. But he kept God in the center of it all. And that's the key. In our life, we all face temptation. Every one of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we are in our life, what point. Some temptation is greater than others. There are certain things that I'm not tempted with that you may be. There are certain things that you may not be tempted with, but that I am. James 1 seems to imply that in his seduction, Satan uses our weaknesses against us. And Paul does say in Ephesians chapter 6, he talks about the wiles of the devil. The word wiles, we use for years because that's what the old King James Version says. The word wiles there, the Greek word simply means a planned system of attack, a strategy, if you will. Now, combine that with James 1, where he talks about every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then you have the idea that this is not something, when we're tempted by Satan, this is not something that maybe necessarily, my temptation is not what you have, because we're all different. And what affects you does not affect me, and what affects me does not affect you. But it does remind us to put that hedge around, to know in advance. Yeah. 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 That's a good point.
So you could also think like juxtapose this with dating.
Yeah.
How that went completely different. You look at this, go look at those old Arab women, what they do, and you look at what they do. It's like, no, not like that.
That's right.
Everybody's a little bit bad.
Sure. You know, he could have justified it any way he wanted to justify it. He could say, well, you know, this is my master's wife. He could have justified it by saying, well, look at her, an Egyptian. I'm Hebrew. Or look at the position that I'm in. Or who's going to know? Yeah, I agree. And the fact that he wasn't worn down, that's key as well. Oh man, I wasn't gonna go there. I thought that, but I wasn't gonna go there. That's sort of like what you said. I wasn't gonna go there. You know, he looked at her and said, "Bless her heart." Oh man, yes, good man. No. I also preached when like I say, I put in my notes. I also, when I preached out of this chapter, I talked about wrong is wrong. And, you know, like I say, he might not have got caught. He could have justified it ever how he wanted to justify it. He could have said, you know, that God's forsaken me, God's put me here. He could have said a lot of things, but he didn't. Wrong's wrong. And Joseph knew that. And so Joseph stood the test. Anything else? Mm-hmm. God. Yeah. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's very true. Anything else? All good. And I think that's a good point to remember that we can sin against our brother, but we ultimately sin against God. Whatever the sin is. And so we sin against our brother, but we sin against God. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves. How can we do that to God? And for me, it's then a constant sharpening of the sword, if you will, in order to push back Satan, because I don't want to do anything to upset or disappoint my God. You've heard me talk about my father a lot, and I make no excuses or apologies for that. I loved my father dearly. And we had a really great relationship, thankfully. But that was in my raising as well. One of the things is my mother would remind me, especially when I went out on dates with Suzanne, remember who you are and what you are. What you are is quite easy. You remember that you're a Christian, Darty. Yes, ma'am. And so that idea of respect can be taught to our children, and it will carry over into our relationship with our Heavenly Father. Anything else? Well, that's really a good place to stop. And so we will start then in the 40th chapter next week. Jay, will you lead us in word of prayer, please?
Father, thank you for this day that you've given us. Thank you for allowing us to come together and participate in this Bible study this morning. especially be with those that are on our prayer list. What we do to just give us the things that we need for your kingdom. Be with us, Father, as we go into this worship time. Help us lift you in song, be able to listen intently to Paul's sermon this morning, and help us change our lives better as we go through this morning. Thank you for all that you do for us, especially thank you for allowing your son to die on the cross for many sins. Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank y'all. Y'all have a great week.